An empire can vanish between one sunrise and the next. This video uncovers the 26 hidden forces that made civilizations collapse overnight. You will gain a powerful new lens to see the vulnerabilities in our own world, and perhaps even recognize the early warnings of decline. What invisible pressure shattered the mighty Khmer Empire, and how could a single bad harvest topple a dynasty that lasted 1,000 years? When you think about the future, which modern structure feels the most permanent, and which feels the most fragile, the idea of an empire vanishing overnight is not about a literal 24-hour countdown. It describes a terrifying acceleration where a civilization's fundamental systems begin to fail in a rapid, unstoppable cascade. Think of it not as a slow fading, but as a final, sudden snap. For generations, an empire might endure slow decay, its borders shrinking and its influence waning. But a true collapse happens at the tipping point, the precise moment when its capacity to recover is finally exhausted. The mighty walls that stood for centuries are not worn down grain by grain, but are breached in a single, decisive assault. Consider the final fall of Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire. This was a civilization with a history stretching back over 1,000 years, a direct successor to Rome itself, yet its end came with shocking speed. After a long siege, the city's legendary defenses were finally overcome in a matter of hours. The empire did not fade away that day, it was extinguished. This dramatic distinction between a slow decline and a sudden collapse is crucial. It forces us to look past the slow grind of history and focus on the final, critical triggers. What are the hidden pressures that build up until the entire structure gives way all at once? Recognizing the nature of this break is the first step to seeing the patterns that lead to catastrophe. A single bad harvest could not topple a great empire on its own, but when its treasury is already hollowed out, that single shock can trigger an unstoppable chain reaction. This is the power of the first hidden force, economic shockwaves. These are not mere recessions, they are fundamental fractures in a civilization's financial backbone. The Roman Empire provides a stark lesson. For centuries, its silver denarius was the trusted currency of the Mediterranean, the dollar of the ancient world. But as Rome's military expenses ballooned, emperors began to secretly debase the coinage, mixing less and less silver into each coin. This was the ancient equivalent of printing endless money. The result was hyperinflation. A bag of coins that once bought a week's groceries might soon be barely enough for a loaf of bread. Trade seized up, savings vanished, and the government could no longer pay its soldiers or officials reliably. This was not just an economic failure, it was a catastrophic failure of trust. When people lose faith in the money in their hands, they lose faith in the system that issued it. This creates a vacuum of authority, a crack in the foundation that other forces eagerly exploit. How many modern economies, built on complex debt and digital currency, are resting on similarly fragile ground? The pattern is alarmingly simple. An empire overextends, funding vast armies or monumental projects with money it does not have. It builds a house of cards on debt and the promise of endless growth. Then a single trigger, a drought, a trade route cut, a plague arrives. The first domino falls, the treasury empties, prices spiral, and the social contract between the state and its people shatters. This economic unraveling rarely happens in isolation. It weakens the empire for the next, even more destructive force waiting in the shadows. When an empire's treasury crumbles, its political unity often shatters next. This second hidden force, political fragmentation, acts like a slow-acting poison within the body of a state. It is the process where a powerful, centralized government splinters into competing factions, each pulling in a different direction until the entire structure tears itself apart. Consider the Empire of Charlemagne, a vast realm that stretched across much of Western Europe. Under his strong, personal rule, it was a formidable power. But when he died, his empire was divided among his grandsons. This was not a simple administrative reshuffle, it was a fatal fracture. The once unified Carolingian Empire dissolved into warring kingdoms, its strength sapped by constant internal squabbles over succession and territory. Without a single, decisive authority, how could such a divided entity possibly muster a coordinated defense against Viking raids or Magyar invasions? It could not. The internal strife consumed all its energy and resources, leaving its borders porous and its people vulnerable. This pattern of fragmentation is devastatingly predictable. Ambitious nobles and military generals, once loyal to the crown, begin to see the central government as weak. They start building their own power bases, hoarding taxes and raising private armies. Corruption becomes rampant as officials prioritize personal gain over public service. The empire, in effect, ceases to act as one entity. It becomes a collection of rival states trapped inside a single, crumbling shell. This internal decay directly paves the way for the next crisis. A unified empire can rally to face a foreign invasion or a natural disaster. A fragmented one is already fighting a civil war on multiple fronts, blind to the existential threat gathering at its gates. The Yuan dynasty in China offers a perfect and tragic example. Established by Kublai Khan, it was part of the vast Mongol Empire, yet within a century it collapsed with stunning speed. Why? The primary cause was not a massive foreign army, but a relentless series of internal power struggles. In the decades leading to its fall, the court was consumed by violent succession disputes. Emperors were overthrown in quick succession, while rival factions of ministers and generals fought for control. The government became so preoccupied with its own internal wars that it lost the mandate of heaven in the eyes of its people. It could no longer govern effectively, maintain infrastructure, or respond to peasant rebellions. The empire did not fall because it was conquered from without. It fell because it had already collapsed from within. Its political core had disintegrated, leaving nothing but a hollow name. This raises a haunting question for any society. How thin is the veneer of political unity, and what happens when the center can no longer hold? Political fragmentation leaves an empire blind to the storms gathering on the horizon, both metaphorical and real. The third hidden force is environmental catastrophe, where the very ground beneath an empire's feet turns against it. The story of the Akkadian Empire, one of the world's first great empires, serves as a sobering example. Around 2,150 years before the Common Era, this powerhouse that dominated Mesopotamia was brought to its knees not by a rival army, but by a devastating drought that lasted for generations. Imagine the lifeblood of a civilization, its rivers and rains simply vanishing. Crops withered in the fields, livestock died of thirst, and the elaborate irrigation systems that fed cities turned into cracked, empty ditches. This was not a single bad season. It was a fundamental shift in the climate that made the land itself uninhabitable. The result was famine on an unimaginable scale, followed by mass migrations as desperate people abandoned their homes in search of food and water. This social chaos shattered the empire from the bottom up, proving that no amount of military might or political cunning can withstand the collapse of the ecosystem that supports it. The Maya civilization faced a similar fate centuries later. Their magnificent cities, tucked deep within Central American jungles, were engineering marvels reliant on precise seasonal rains. When those rains failed during prolonged dry periods, their reservoirs dried up and their agricultural system collapsed. The intricate social and political order, built on the promise of plenty from the kings who communicated with the gods, disintegrated. The people simply walked away from their stone pyramids, leaving them to be reclaimed by the forest. These environmental crises expose a profound and often ignored vulnerability. An empire can build vast armies and towering monuments, but it is utterly dependent on a stable and predictable natural world. When that foundation crumbles, the social contract dissolves into a desperate struggle for survival. This force reminds us that human ambition is always and forever tethered to the health of the planet. How many of our own modern cities, built in arid regions or on vulnerable coastlines, are testing those same ancient limits today? A vast empire can become its own worst enemy, not through weakness but through sheer, unchecked strength. The fourth hidden force is military overextension, the fatal flaw of stretching an army beyond its capacity to sustain itself. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, offers a breathtaking case study. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, its horse archers conquered with terrifying speed, creating a realm that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe. Yet this very speed became its undoing. The empire grew so vast so quickly that it became impossible to govern as a single unit. Communication and supply lines stretched over thousands of miles, becoming thin and vulnerable. Without a strong, centralized command, the empire naturally fractured into separate khanates, each pursuing its own interests. The whole was no longer greater than the sum of its parts, it was weaker. This is the paradox of overextension. The further you reach, the less you can truly hold. Maintaining distant frontiers drains a treasury and bleeds manpower, forcing an empire to constantly recruit more soldiers and raise more taxes from a population that sees little benefit. This cycle breeds resentment at home and creates a brittle, overconfident military culture abroad. Commanders begin to believe in their own invincibility, leading them to underestimate rivals they see as inferior. The Byzantine Empire learned this lesson at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. For centuries, Byzantium was the shield of Christendom, its armies legendary. But years of fighting on multiple fronts had weakened its forces. When Emperor Romanos IV led his army against the Seljuk Turks, he was confident of victory. Instead, due to tactical errors and betrayal from rival factions within his own court, his army was surrounded and annihilated. The emperor himself was captured. Manzikert was not just a lost battle, it was a seismic shock. It shattered the myth of Byzantine invincibility and opened the floodgates. With its primary field army destroyed, the empire had no way to stop the Seljuk Turks from pouring into the heart of Anatolia, its most vital recruiting and agricultural base. This single military reversal triggered a cascade of collapse from which the empire never fully recovered. It shows that a fortress, no matter how strong, cannot stand if its defenders are spread too thin across its walls. The story of military overextension is a timeless warning about the limits of power. How many modern superpowers maintaining global networks of bases and commitments are silently straining under a similar, invisible weight? This internal weakening creates a perfect opportunity for the next, and perhaps most obvious, hidden force to strike, the external invasion that finally breaks the camel's back. A weakened empire is a beacon to its enemies. The fifth hidden force, external invasions, is the final, decisive hammer blow that shatters a civilization already cracked from within. These are not random attacks, but targeted strikes that exploit every internal flaw, delivering a coup de grace to a state already on its knees. The Viking raids across early medieval Europe perfectly illustrate this predatory instinct. They did not attack the Frankish Empire at its peak under Charlemagne. Instead, they swarmed its coasts and navigated its rivers precisely when his successors were tearing the realm apart in civil wars. The Vikings saw the fragmentation, the lack of coordinated defense, and they pounced, turning internal political failure into an existential crisis. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating example was the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in the year 410. For 800 years, the city of Rome had been considered impregnable, the eternal heart of a world-spanning empire. Its fall was not just a military defeat, it was the shattering of a fundamental myth. When King Alaric and his warriors breached the gates, the event sent a shockwave of terror and disbelief across the entire Mediterranean. The unthinkable had happened. The result was not merely the looting of a city, but a catastrophic collapse of confidence. Romans who had believed their world was permanent suddenly lost all faith. There was a mass flight from the city, a panicked recognition that the old order was gone forever. The invasion proved that the empire's legendary legions could no longer protect its very heart. These external forces rarely appear out of nowhere. They are drawn to vulnerability like vultures to a wounded animal. An empire strained by economic inflation, political infighting, and environmental stress presents an irresistible target. Invaders, whether nomadic horsemen from the steppes or seafaring raiders, often possess mobility and tactics that a slow, bureaucratic state cannot match. They use speed and surprise to overwhelm static defenses, and they exploit the discontent of a population that may have lost its loyalty to a corrupt or distant central government. In many cases, the invading army is merely the spark that ignites a pile of dry tinder that the empire itself has spent decades gathering. This dynamic forces us to rethink the very nature of defense. How does an empire maintain strong diplomatic relationships and military readiness without succumbing to the paranoia and expense that leads to overextension? The sustainability of any great power hinges on this delicate balance, a lesson written in the ashes of countless fallen cities. Even the strongest walls cannot hold back a tide of popular fury. The sixth hidden force is social unrest and revolt, the moment when the governed decide they will no longer be governed. This is not mere protest, it is a fundamental rejection of the established order, a fire that burns from the bottom up and can consume a regime with breathtaking speed. Consider the Peasants Revolt that swept through England in 1381. For decades, the common people had endured the crushing burden of poll taxes, a flat fee that fell heaviest on the poor. Then the Black Death had ravaged the population, giving the surviving laborers a new sense of their own worth and power. When the government tried to impose yet another unfair tax, the spark was lit. Tens of thousands of peasants, led by figures like Wat Tyler, marched on London. They stormed the Tower of London, executed the Lord Chancellor and the Lord Treasurer, and confronted the young King Richard II himself. The entire structure of English authority was paralyzed in a matter of days. The revolt was eventually suppressed, but the shock waves it sent through the nobility were permanent. It proved that the consent of the governed was not a formality, but the very foundation of power. When that consent is withdrawn, an empire stands on pillars of sand. Across the Channel, the Jacquerie in 14th century France tells a similar story of explosive discontent. In the wake of a military disaster and amid the chaos of the 100 Years' War, French nobles were seen as having failed in their primary duty to protect the people. The peasantry, brutalized by both enemy soldiers and their own lords, rose up in a paroxysm of violence. They burned castles and slaughtered nobles, their rage directed at the entire feudal system that oppressed them. The Jacquerie was not an organized revolution with a political manifesto. It was a raw, visceral outburst of hatred born from profound inequality and a loss of faith in the ruling class. It exposed the deep social fractures that no amount of knightly valor could mend. These uprisings share a common recipe for disaster. The ingredients are always some mix of economic inequality, where the gap between the rich and the poor becomes a chasm, perceived injustice from a corrupt or indifferent government, and a triggering event like a new tax or a military defeat. The fuel is the belief that the system is rigged, that the rulers are illegitimate, and that the common person has nothing left to lose. This force asks us a difficult question. How does any empire maintain the loyalty of its people during times of scarcity and fear? Grand monuments and military parades mean nothing to a starving, disillusioned population. True power, in the end, resides not in the throne room but in the hearts of the people. And when their hearts turn to anger, the collapse can be as sudden as it is absolute. A society's own success can become its greatest trap. The seventh hidden force is technological stagnation, the quiet failure to adapt that leaves an empire defenseless against a changing world. No civilization illustrates this better than the Ottoman Empire by the 17th century. At its peak, the Ottoman military machine was a marvel of innovation, fielding advanced cannons and disciplined janissary corps that could shatter any medieval army. But over time, that very success bred a dangerous complacency. While European rivals relentlessly improved their naval gunnery, ship design, and infantry tactics, the Ottoman Empire clung to the systems that had once made it great. Its institutions grew rigid, its scholars and engineers increasingly isolated from the scientific revolutions unfolding in the West. The consequence was not a sudden defeat, but a slow, grinding loss of strategic advantage. In battle after battle, Ottoman forces found themselves outranged and outmaneuvered by more advanced European armies. A technological gap that was once negligible widened into a chasm, and an empire built on military supremacy began to lose wars it was once destined to win. This was not merely about weapons, it was about a mindset. The Ottomans failed to foster a culture of continuous innovation, and that intellectual freeze proved fatal to their power. The arrival of gunpowder in Europe offers another stark lesson in technological disruption. For centuries, the feudal lord in his stone castle was the ultimate symbol of military and political power. His fortress seemed impregnable, a physical manifestation of a social order that appeared eternal. Then came cannons capable of battering down those mighty walls. Almost overnight, the military foundation of feudalism crumbled. The castle, once a guarantee of security, became a death trap. This single technological shift did not just change how wars were fought, it helped dismantle an entire political and economic system, empowering centralized monarchs who could afford these new expensive armies and weakening the local nobility. The refusal to embrace new tools of production or destruction is rarely a conscious choice. It is often a symptom of deeper cultural and intellectual shifts. An empire that becomes too satisfied with its own traditions, that discourages curiosity and punishes dissent, is an empire that has already begun to die. It loses the capacity to see the future approaching. It mistakes its past glory for a guarantee of perpetual dominance. This force pushes us to ask a difficult question about our own era. In a time of artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, which of our most cherished institutions are the modern equivalent of the medieval castle, seemingly unshakable but potentially one innovation away from irrelevance? The stability of an empire rests on more than just armies and taxes. It depends on a shared story that holds its people together. The eighth hidden force is cultural and intellectual shifts. the quiet revolutions in thought that can dissolve the glue of a civilization from the inside. A powerful example is the earthquake of the Protestant Reformation, which ripped through the heart of the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century. For centuries, religious unity under the Pope in Rome had been a bedrock of political authority. Then, Martin Luther and other reformers challenged that very foundation, questioning the Church's doctrines and its right to govern faith. This was not a military invasion, but an invasion of ideas, and it proved impossible to stop with swords. The empire fractured along religious lines, with princes and their territories choosing sides in a conflict that shattered any pretense of central unity. The result was decades of devastating religious wars that bled the empire dry, proving that a challenge to a core belief can be as destructive as any army. This pattern of intellectual upheaval reshaping power is a constant in history. The Renaissance, with its celebration of human potential and scientific inquiry, gradually weakened the medieval church's monopoly on truth and education. As people began to look to classical reason and empirical observation rather than solely to religious doctrine, the entire intellectual framework that supported feudal hierarchies began to crumble. New ideas about individual rights and the nature of authority, once they take root, cannot be easily unthought. They inspire artists, philosophers, and eventually revolutionaries. They make old forms of control seem illegitimate and unjust. Why should a king rule by divine right if his subjects believe power derives from the people? This erosion of traditional authority is a slow, silent crisis for any ruling class. It creates a population that is harder to govern, more likely to question, and more receptive to calls for reform or outright rebellion. This intellectual ferment rarely occurs in a vacuum. It is almost always intertwined with the next hidden force, a transformation in how an empire creates and controls its wealth. A civilization's arteries are its trade routes, and when they are severed, the entire body begins to starve. The ninth hidden force is trade route disruption, a silent killer that can bleed an empire dry of wealth, resources, and even vital information. For centuries, the Silk Road was the world's greatest economic engine, a sprawling network of caravan trails connecting China to the Mediterranean. The wealth of empires flowed along these paths, but that flow was entirely dependent on stability. When the vast Mongol Empire, which had once protected and unified these routes, itself began to fragment in the 14th century, the consequences were catastrophic. The political instability unleashed bandits, warlords, and closed crucial way stations, making the overland journey impossibly dangerous and expensive. The silk, spices, and ideas simply stopped moving. This was not just an economic recession, it was a systemic failure that toppled the empires like the Ilkhanate in Persia, whose power was built on that very commerce. They were starved into oblivion. The same principle can strike from the sea. Look at the decline of the Venetian trade empire. For generations, Venice was the unrivaled queen of the Mediterranean. Its wealth built on a naval monopoly that controlled the flow of goods between East and West. Then new forces emerged. The Ottoman Empire began to block key sea lanes, while Portuguese explorers discovered a sea route around Africa to India, bypassing the Mediterranean entirely. Venice was suddenly cut off, its economic model rendered obsolete. The galleys that had once brought unimaginable riches into its lagoon now returned empty. Without that constant influx of wealth, Venice could no longer afford its powerful navy or maintain its political influence. It did not fall in a dramatic battle. It simply faded into a beautiful museum, a ghost of its former commercial power. This force reveals a profound vulnerability in any interconnected system. An empire can be perfectly strong internally, but if the external networks that supply its lifeblood are cut, it will wither. A blockade, a shift in piracy, or the simple discovery of a better, cheaper route can drain a treasury with terrifying speed. It asks us to look at our own globalized world and wonder, what are the modern Silk Roads, the vital supply chains of data and goods, and how fragile are they really? When the flow stops, what remains of the power it once sustained? A microscopic organism, invisible to the naked eye, can accomplish what the mightiest armies cannot. The 10th hidden force is epidemics and plagues, biological shocks that tear through the human foundations of an empire with terrifying indifference. The Black Death of the 14th century stands as the ultimate example, a catastrophe that reshaped the world. Arriving in Europe via trade routes from Asia, the plague killed an estimated 25 million people, perhaps 1/3 of the entire continent's population. This was not merely a tragedy of lost lives, it was a systemic collapse. With so many dead, fields lay fallow because there was no one to till them. Armies could not be raised because there were no soldiers to recruit. Tax revenues evaporated because the taxpayers were gone. The entire feudal economy, built on a vast base of peasant labor, was thrown into chaos. The scarcity of workers actually empowered the survivors, who could now demand higher wages and better conditions, further destabilizing the old social order. This was a feedback loop of decline, where a demographic crash triggered economic and military failure, which in turn made recovery impossible. Centuries earlier, the plague of Justinian delivered a similar blow to the Byzantine Empire. Beginning in the 6th century, this outbreak of bubonic plague ravaged the empire's capital and its provinces for years, killing millions and recurring in waves. The Byzantine Empire under Justinian was at the height of its power, having reconquered vast territories in Italy and North Africa. But the plague emptied its treasury and decimated its army, leaving it financially and demographically exhausted. The empire became a hollow shell, its strength sapped from within. This profound weakness left it utterly susceptible to the later invasions that would chip away at its territory for centuries, a direct line drawn from a disease to the eventual fall of Constantinople. These health crises never act alone. They intersect with every other vulnerability, turning economic strain into collapse, political friction into paralysis, and military overextension into certain defeat. A plague does not just kill people, it shatters the very assumption of continuity that an empire is built upon. It forces us to ask what happens when the people who grow the food, collect the taxes, and form the armies simply vanish. The answer is written in the empty villages and silent cities of history, a stark reminder that the most formidable walls are useless against an enemy you cannot see. A single flawed individual can unravel the strongest empire from the top down. The 11th hidden force, leadership crises, exposes the terrifying fragility of power when it rests in the wrong hands. The sudden death of a ruler can create a vacuum of authority, but the prolonged reign of an incompetent or cruel one is often far more damaging. Consider the anarchy that consumed England after King Henry I died in 1135. He left no clear male heir, only a daughter named Matilda. This single uncertainty over succession ignited a 19-year civil war between Matilda and her cousin Stephen of Blois. The entire kingdom became a battleground, with barons shifting allegiances and terrorizing the countryside. The chronicles of the time lamented that Christ and his saints slept, a testament to the complete collapse of law and order. This was not just a political dispute, it was a systemic failure caused by the absence of a single, undisputed leader. The state without its head turned on itself. Incompetence can be as destructive as a contested throne. The reign of the Roman Emperor Caligula stands as a timeless lesson in how one individual's pathologies can endanger an entire civilization. His erratic and often cruel behavior was not merely the stuff of scandalous stories, it had real and devastating consequences for the empire's stability. He depleted the vast treasury left by his predecessor on lavish and pointless projects, declared war on the sea, and fostered a culture of paranoia that led to constant assassination plots. His rule demonstrated that when the ultimate authority is seen as illegitimate, irrational, or dangerous, the entire system of governance begins to rot. Morale collapses among soldiers and officials, corruption flourishes as everyone seeks to protect themselves, and the empire loses its capacity for coherent action. This force underscores a critical vulnerability. The quality of governance is not a luxury. It is the very framework that allows a society to weather storms. A strong, stable leadership structure with clear rules for succession is a civilization's immune system. When that system fails, the empire is left exposed, not just to external enemies, but to the chaos festering within its own heart. How many great powers have fallen not from a lack of strength, but from a simple failure to wisely pass the torch? A shared faith can be the strongest bond holding an empire together until it becomes the fault line that tears it apart. The 12th hidden force is religious schism, a deep ideological rift that shatters the spiritual unity empires often rely on for their legitimacy. The Great Schism of 1054 stands as a monumental example, a single, dramatic event that formally divided Christianity into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic branches. This was far more than a theological disagreement. It was a geopolitical earthquake. The mutual excommunications between the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople severed the cultural and political ties between Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire. This division created two separate and often opposing spheres of influence, crippling the potential for a unified Christian front against common threats. The Byzantine Empire, already straining under military and economic pressure, lost a crucial source of political and moral support from the West, leaving it increasingly isolated in a dangerous world. These conflicts over doctrine and authority rarely stay confined to houses of worship. They ignite wars, alienate entire populations, and drain an empire's resources in endless doctrinal disputes. The Crusades, launched by the Latin West to reclaim the Holy Land, initially seemed to demonstrate the power of a united Christian cause. For some, like certain Italian maritime republics, they provided a short-term economic boom. Yet, in the long run, they sowed seeds of enduring discord. The Fourth Crusade's devastating sack of Constantinople in 1204, a Christian army attacking a Christian city, exposed the deep hatred that had festered since the Schism. This act did not just loot a city, it shattered any lingering pretense of unity between East and West, delivering a wound to the Byzantine Empire from which it never truly recovered. The Crusades ultimately weakened the very civilizations they were meant to champion, diverting colossal resources and lives into external conflicts while internal cohesion crumbled. These schisms reveal a profound truth about imperial power. An ideology that once provided a common identity and purpose can, when fractured, become a source of irreconcilable conflict. It turns brother against brother and makes political compromise impossible. How does any empire maintain its authority when the God it claims to represent is suddenly the subject of a bitter dispute? This force of division is a powerful reminder that the most dangerous battles are often not fought over land or gold, but over the meaning of heaven itself. How does a civilization vanish when it still possesses the tools and knowledge to survive? The 13th hidden force is resource depletion, the slow, silent theft of an empire's own life support. It is the story of a society consuming its future to feed its present, until one day the future simply arrives empty. The most haunting example is Easter Island, a remote outpost in the Pacific. Its people, the Rapa Nui, built the iconic Moai statues, a breathtaking cultural achievement. But to move these massive stone figures, they needed vast quantities of timber for ropes and rollers. They cut down every last tree. The deforestation led to catastrophic soil erosion, making it impossible to grow enough food. The loss of trees also meant no wood for building fishing canoes, cutting off their supply of protein from the sea. The society that erected those magnificent monuments soon descended into famine, warfare, and cannibalism, a stark lesson in how a culture can literally fell the very foundation it stands upon. This is not an ancient anomaly, it is a pattern. The great Mesopotamian empires, the cradle of civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, mastered irrigation to turn the desert green. But their sophisticated canal systems had a fatal flaw. They constantly brought salt to the surface of the soil. Over centuries, this salinity built up, slowly poisoning the land. Wheat, the staple crop, could no longer grow. Yields plummeted, and what was once the Fertile Crescent became a salted wasteland. The empires of Sumer and Akkad did not fall to a mighty army. They were starved into oblivion by the very technology that had made them powerful. Their agricultural miracle contained the seeds of its own destruction. This pattern of overexploitation is a trap that ensnares the mighty and the modest alike. An empire expands, its population grows, and its demand for arable land, fresh water, and precious minerals skyrockets. The logic of growth demands more, always more. Forests are cleared for farmland until the watersheds fail. Mines are dug deeper until the veins of ore run dry. Rivers are diverted for cities until the fields downstream turn to dust. The initial wealth this creates masks the long-term cost until the moment of reckoning arrives. Famine strikes not because of a single drought, but because the land itself has been exhausted. Economic collapse follows as the primary sources of wealth vanish. And finally, conflict erupts over the last remaining pools of water and pockets of fertile soil. The empire turns on itself in a desperate scramble for scraps. This force asks a deeply unsettling question of our own time. How do we measure real wealth? Is it the size of our treasury and the grandeur of our cities? Or is it the health of our soil, the purity of our water, and the resilience of our ecosystems? The fallen statues of Easter Island stand as a silent warning, a monument to a society that mastered its art but failed to manage its resources. The rot of an empire often begins not on its frontiers, but deep within its own administrative heart. A sprawling bureaucracy designed to manage the complex affairs of state can become a labyrinth of self-interest where the public good is sacrificed for private profit. This 14th hidden force is bureaucratic corruption, a silent cancer that paralyzes an empire from the inside out. Consider the late Roman Empire. Its vast administration, once the marvel of the ancient world, became clogged with officials who saw their positions not as a duty, but as an investment. They purchased their posts with the explicit goal of enriching themselves through bribes and embezzlement, knowing they had to recoup their initial outlay and then some. Tax collectors would extort far more than was owed, lining their own pockets while crushing the peasantry. When a crisis like a barbarian incursion or a famine struck, the very system meant to respond was too busy profiting from the disaster to act. Resources meant for the legions were diverted, infrastructure repairs were left undone, and the trust between the state and its citizens evaporated. This was not merely a moral failure, it was a catastrophic misallocation of a civilization's lifeblood. The Holy Roman Empire offers another stark portrait of this institutional decay. By the 17th century, the practice of selling offices had become endemic. Key positions, from local judges to treasury officials, were auctioned off to the highest bidder. The result was a government staffed not by the most competent or loyal, but by the wealthiest and most corrupt. Justice could be bought and sold, laws were enforced selectively, and long-term planning became impossible because every official was focused on their own short-term gain. How could such an empire possibly formulate a coherent foreign policy or muster a unified army when every function of the state was undermined by personal greed? This culture of corruption creates a death spiral. It discourages honest talent, rewards the unscrupulous, and makes any attempt at reform nearly impossible because the corrupt system will fiercely protect itself. The empire loses its ability to adapt, to collect taxes fairly, to dispense justice, or to defend its people. It becomes a hollow shell, a nominal state that has, in truth, already ceased to function. The walls may still stand, but the will to maintain them has long since been sold to the highest bidder. This slow-moving collapse of governance raises a chilling question for any complex society. How do you measure the true health of an institution? Is it in its grand pronouncements or in the quiet, daily actions of its mid-level administrators, the ones who truly decide whether the system serves the people or merely itself? A state can be hollowed out from within long before its final collapse, not by armies or plagues, but by the simple, relentless mathematics of its own people. The 15th hidden force is demographic change, the silent tectonic shifts in population that can fracture the foundations of any empire. The Great Migration period of late antiquity offers the ultimate case study. For centuries, the Roman Empire's frontiers were defined by the Rhine and Danube rivers, guarded by disciplined legions. But in the 4th and 5th centuries, a chain reaction of events far to the east, including pressure from the Huns, set entire Germanic nations in motion. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Franks, they were not mere raiding parties. They were entire populations on the march with their families, their herds, and their warriors. The Roman border defenses, designed to repel military incursions, were utterly overwhelmed by this human tide. These migrations did not just breach the empire's physical walls, they irrevocably altered its cultural and political landscape. The newcomers settled within the empire's territory, establishing their own kingdoms and laws, and effectively dismantling Roman authority from the inside out. The Western Roman Empire did not just fall, it was gradually replaced, its identity diluted, and its power subsumed by the very people it had once labeled barbarians. This pattern is not confined to ancient history. Demographics exert a constant, powerful pressure on the structure of a state. An aging population, for instance, creates a crushing economic burden, with a shrinking workforce forced to support a growing number of retirees through taxation. This drains a treasury and stifles innovation. Conversely, a youth bulge, where a large proportion of the population is young and unemployed, becomes a potent source of social unrest and political instability. These young people, full of energy and ambition but with few opportunities, are easily mobilized for rebellion or recruited into extremist movements. Medieval societies frequently grappled with these pressures, their delicate feudal economies thrown into chaos by sudden population, declines from plague or surges from periods of peace and good harvests. The balance between people, resources, and power is always precarious. When that balance is lost, the social contract tears at the seams. How does an empire maintain its cohesion when the very makeup of its people is transformed? This invisible force of human movement and birth rates proves that the strength of a civilization is not just in its laws or its armies, but in the vitality and structure of its population. And as these demographic pressures build, they create a desperate need for the next hidden force, a single technological leap that can shatter the old order and redefine the very nature of conflict. A single technological leap can shield an empire for centuries, until the day it becomes its coffin. The 16th hidden force is the military technology gap, a terrifying chasm on the battlefield where one side's tools of war render the other's utterly obsolete. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire is the ultimate brutal lesson. Hernán Cortés arrived on the shores of Mexico with a few hundred men, facing an empire of millions. His advantages were not just courage or cunning, they were technological. The Aztecs fought with obsidian-bladed clubs and cotton armor, weapons designed for a ritualized form of combat to capture prisoners. They faced Spanish steel swords that could slice through their defenses, crossbows that could kill at a distance, and firearms whose thunderous roar and lethal power seemed like sorcery. But the true force multiplier was not just the gun, it was the steel. Spanish plate armor turned Aztec strikes into glancing blows, while Spanish blades carved through native weaponry. This was not a war, it was a systemic shock. The psychological impact of these unknown technologies shattered the Aztec worldview and paralyzed their military response, allowing a tiny force to topple a giant. The same principle unfolded on the muddy fields of Agincourt in 1415. The French army, a glittering host of heavily armored knights, represented the pinnacle of medieval chivalry. They faced a weary, outnumbered English force, but the English had the longbow, a 6-foot stave of yew wood that could launch arrows with enough force to pierce plate armor at 250 yards. The French knights, bogged down in the mud, were systematically slaughtered by a storm of arrows they could not reach. Agincourt was more than a lost battle. It was a demonstration that a single technological advantage could annihilate the military doctrine of an entire age. The knight, the symbol of feudal power, was suddenly vulnerable to a commoner with a bow. The most tragic examples, however, are not of those who lacked the technology, but of those who refused it. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, a warrior class famed for its mounted archery, viewed the newly arrived firearm with contempt to them. It was a dishonorable weapon, a coward's tool that required no martial skill. They clung to their traditional mastery of the horse and bow, even as their Ottoman rivals enthusiastically embraced cannon and muskets. This cultural resistance proved fatal. In 1517, the Ottoman army, equipped with modern artillery, met the Mamluks at the Battle of Ridania. The Mamluk cavalry launched a brave, traditional charge directly into the teeth of the Ottoman gun line. They were mowed down, the Sultan was killed, and Cairo fell shortly after. The Mamluks were not defeated by a lack of courage, but by a fatal gap in technology that their own pride had created. This force reveals a harsh truth about power. What makes you strong in one era can make you a relic in the next. An empire's military is not just a fighting force, it is a learning organization. Its survival depends on its ability to look at the horizon, see the next great disruption, and have the humility to adapt before that disruption arrives on its doorstep. In a world of drones and cyber warfare, which of our own proudest weapons are already on the path to becoming the next longbow, revered for its history but hopeless against the future? No empire is an island, even when it stands alone. The 17th hidden force is diplomatic isolation, the slow erosion of friendships that leaves a civilization dangerously exposed. Alliances are more than just treaties, they form a protective web of mutual interest, deterring aggression and ensuring the flow of trade and information. When that web unravels, a once mighty power can find itself surrounded by hostile neighbors, its fate sealed not by a single battle, but by the silence where its friends used to be. The Kingdom of Hungary learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. For generations, it had been the bulwark of Christendom, holding back the expanding Ottoman Empire. But in 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, the Hungarians faced the full might of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. They fought bravely, but they fought alone. Their calls for a united Christian crusade went unanswered by their European neighbors, who were preoccupied with their own rivalries and the rising tide of the Reformation. The Hungarian army was annihilated, their king killed, and their kingdom was partitioned and absorbed. They were not defeated solely by Ottoman cannons, but by the chilling reality of diplomatic abandonment. Their isolation turned a difficult fight into a national catastrophe. Just decades earlier, the ambitious Burgundian state met a similar fate through a cascade of diplomatic miscalculations. Under Duke Charles the Bold, Burgundy was a rising power, a rich and sprawling domain nestled between France and the Holy Roman Empire. Charles sought to forge a kingdom of his own, but he did so by making enemies of nearly every power around him. He alienated the Swiss Confederacy, provoked the French king, and failed to secure lasting alliances. When he finally went to war, he found himself facing a coalition of united enemies who had once been divided. At the Battle of Nancy in 1477, Charles was killed and his army destroyed. With no strong allies to protect it, the Burgundian state was swiftly dismembered and annexed by France and the Habsburgs. Its vast wealth and lands were not enough to save it from the consequences of its own diplomatic failure. This force reveals a profound truth about power on the world stage. Strength is not just measured in armies, but in the number of hands willing to stand with you in a crisis. An empire that burns its bridges, that acts with arrogant self-assurance, may appear invincible for a time, but when the storm finally hits, it will have no one to help shore up its defenses. The fall of Hungary and the annexation of Burgundy ask us a difficult question. How many of history's great collapses were not about a lack of internal strength, but a simple, fatal failure to maintain the friendships that make strength meaningful? In the end, the most formidable fortress can be rendered useless if everyone outside its walls has turned away. A government's most desperate act is often to secretly steal from its own people. The 18th hidden force, monetary devaluation, is this very theft, a quiet betrayal that shatters an empire's economic soul from the inside. We saw it with Rome's silver denarius, but the crisis reached its peak in the 3rd century. Emperors, desperate to pay restless legions and fund endless civil wars, systematically hollowed out their own currency. They reduced the silver content in coins to a thin, worthless wash, flooding the empire with fake money. The result was an economic apocalypse. A measure of wheat that cost a handful of coins one year might require a wheelbarrow full the next. Hyperinflation devoured the life savings of ordinary citizens and the fixed salaries of soldiers, turning stability into chaos. Why would a farmer trade his grain for a bag of worthless metal? He would not. The formal economy, built on trust in coinage, collapsed back into a fragile barter system, making large-scale trade and taxation nearly impossible. The state, which had created the crisis to fund itself, found its own revenue streams drying up. This was more than an economic failure. It was a complete dissolution of the social contract. When people cannot trust the money in their hands, they cease to trust the authority that mints it. The empire lost its financial legitimacy long before it lost its final battles. This ancient pattern of debasement echoes through history, a stark warning about the delicate thread connecting fiscal responsibility to public faith. How thin is that thread in our own world of digital currencies and quantitative easing, when the value of money is an abstract concept managed by complex algorithms and central banks? What invisible line once crossed would cause that crucial trust to vanish forever? A city can choke on its own success. The 19th hidden force is urban overcrowding, the silent pressure cooker that transforms vibrant centers of trade and culture into tinderboxes of disease and discontent. Medieval London provides a textbook example. Its population swelled far beyond what its cramped, winding streets could support. There was no proper sewage system, so waste was simply dumped into open gutters that flowed into the Thames River, the city's main source of drinking water. This toxic cocktail was a perfect breeding ground for disaster. When the Black Death arrived, it found a population already weakened by poor sanitation and malnutrition, and it burned through the overcrowded tenements with horrifying speed. The density itself became a weapon, turning a health crisis into a catastrophe. But the danger was not just biological. These cramped, flammable wooden cities lived under the constant threat of fire. A single spark in one overcrowded district could, and often did, consume the entire city. As the Great Fire of London would later prove, overcrowding does not just strain infrastructure, it frays the very fabric of society. Competition for scarce housing and resources drives up prices and fuels resentment between the rich and the poor, creating a constant undercurrent of social tension that can erupt into violence at the slightest provocation. This pattern is not confined to the medieval world. Look across the Atlantic to the ancient city of Cahokia. Around the year 1000, it was the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, a bustling metropolis with a population that may have reached 20,000 people. Its residents built enormous earthen mounds that still stand today, but within a few centuries the city was completely abandoned. Why? While the reasons are complex, archaeologists point to the immense strain of urban stress. Supporting such a dense population would have required a constant and enormous flow of resources, especially food from the surrounding farmland. It is likely that deforestation and overhunting depleted the local environment. The crowded living conditions would have made the city vulnerable to the rapid spread of disease, and any disruption to the food supply, whether from drought or soil exhaustion, would have led to immediate famine and social unrest. Cahokia did not necessarily fall to an invader. It may have simply become too big to sustain itself, its people eventually dispersing back into the countryside in search of a more stable life. This force of urban overcrowding rarely acts alone. It magnifies every other vulnerability. An economic shock hits a dense city harder as prices for basic goods skyrocket. Political fragmentation leaves crowded populations without effective governance, descending into chaos. An epidemic in an overcrowded center becomes an unstoppable plague. The city, meant to be the pinnacle of civilization, becomes its own worst enemy, a concentrated point of failure where the smallest crack can bring the entire structure down. It forces us to look at our own gleaming megacities and wonder how much of their stability is an illusion, maintained only by a constant, precarious flow of resources that could be severed in an instant. Even the most resilient crops will fail when the seasons themselves turn against you. The 20th hidden force is climate change anomalies, sudden and dramatic shifts in the global climate that shatter the agricultural foundation of entire civilizations. The Norse settlements in Greenland stand as a haunting monument to this vulnerability. For centuries, these Viking communities thrived, their Scandinavian way of life transplanted to a world of green pastures during a period known as the medieval warm period. They built stone churches, raised cattle, and traded with Europe, but then, in the 14th century, the climate turned. The Little Ice Age descended, bringing with it bitterly cold summers and expanding glaciers. The growing season shrank, pastures froze, and the sea ice that surrounded them for longer periods cut off vital trade routes. The Norse, clinging to their European identity, refused to fully adopt the survival strategies of the indigenous Inuit, who were expertly adapted to the harsh conditions. They continued to try to farm and ranch as their ancestors had, even as the land could no longer support it. One by one, their settlements were abandoned, leaving only silent ruins in the snow. They were not conquered, they were simply starved out by a changing world they could not or would not adapt to. This pattern of climate-driven collapse is terrifyingly common. A stable, predictable climate is the invisible scaffold supporting an empire's food production, trade networks, and social stability. When that scaffold is suddenly kicked away, the entire structure teeters. A prolonged drought can turn fertile breadbaskets into dust bowls, forcing mass migrations of desperate people. A volcanic eruption that spews ash into the atmosphere can trigger a volcanic winter, leading to global famine, just as the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 led to the infamous year without a summer. These anomalies do not create entirely new problems, they act as brutal amplifiers, turning existing vulnerabilities into fatal crises. A kingdom already straining from high taxes will fracture when a famine strikes. An empire with brittle supply chains will snap when harvests fail for 3 years in a row. The real test is not the climate shift itself, but an empire's adaptive capacity. Can its farmers switch to new, hardier crops? Can its government create and manage emergency grain reserves? Can its people migrate to more favorable lands? Or will they turn on each other in a desperate struggle for the last scraps of food? The fate of the Norse in Greenland forces us to ask a difficult question about our own time. How many of our own complex systems, from global agriculture to urban infrastructure, are built on the silent and potentially fragile assumption of a stable climate? The weather patterns we take for granted are not a permanent guarantee, but a temporary stage on which our civilization performs. What happens when that stage suddenly and dramatically shifts beneath our feet? A civilization that stops asking questions has already begun writing its epitaph. The 21st hidden force is intellectual stagnation, the quiet death of curiosity that leaves an empire mentally unarmed for the challenges ahead. The decline of the Islamic Golden Age offers a heartbreaking case study. For centuries, from around the 8th to the 14th, the Islamic world was the global center of learning. Its scholars preserved ancient Greek texts that Europe had forgotten, and they made breathtaking advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and chemistry. They were not just preserving knowledge, they were expanding its frontiers. But then, the intellectual climate shifted. A growing emphasis on religious orthodoxy began to discourage the kind of open inquiry and philosophical debate that had fueled this golden age. The influential theologian Al-Ghazali argued that philosophy was incompatible with faith, and his writings slowly eroded support for the rational sciences. The great libraries and translation houses that had been engines of innovation saw their funding dry up and their influence wane. The empire did not lose its military strength overnight, but it lost something far more vital, its capacity for renewal. While Europe was awakening with the Renaissance, the Islamic world, which had provided the very spark for that reawakening, was gradually turning inward, its intellectual light dimming. The fate of the Platonic Academy in Athens serves as a powerful symbol of this process. Founded by Plato himself, this school had operated for nearly 900 years, a continuous thread of philosophical inquiry running through the classical world. But in the year 529, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I ordered it closed, viewing its pagan teachings as a threat to Christian orthodoxy. The philosophers were forced to flee, and the doors of one of history's greatest centers of thought were shuttered forever. This act did not just close a school, it represented a triumph of dogma over dialogue, of rigid certainty over open-ended questioning. When a society stops valuing new ideas, it begins a slow but irreversible decay. Its technology becomes outdated, its governance grows inflexible, and its culture loses the vitality needed to inspire its people and intimidate its rivals. The libraries and universities are not just buildings, they are the immune system of a civilization, constantly generating new antibodies of thought to fight off the diseases of stagnation and dogma. How many modern institutions, once famed for their groundbreaking research, have slowly ossified into defenders of the status quo, mistaking tradition for truth? The fall of a great empire is often preceded by a long silence in its halls of learning, a silence that speaks louder than any invading army. Even the most brilliant empire is a hostage to its supply lines. The 22nd hidden force is supply chain breakdowns, the sudden severing of the vital arteries that carry food, materials, and information across a realm. When these flows are interrupted by war, disaster, or sheer incompetence, the entire system can seize up and paralyze a civilization. The mighty Han dynasty in China learned this lesson through its dependence on the Silk Road. This was not just a luxury goods route, it was a critical supply line for wealth, intelligence, and exotic materials that fueled the Han economy and military prestige. When internal rebellions or nomadic incursions periodically cut the route, the shockwaves were immediate. The court lost access to vital revenues and strategic information, while cities dependent on the trade saw markets collapse and artisans lose their livelihoods. A single break in that chain could trigger economic contraction and social unrest hundreds of miles away. This reveals a profound truth. An empire is not just its armies and cities, but the invisible, fragile web of connections that sustains them. The medieval Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 offers an even starker portrait of this vulnerability. It began with a period of unusually heavy rainfall and cold weather that ruined harvests across northern Europe. This was a disaster, but not necessarily a civilization-ending one. The true collapse came from the breakdown in distribution. The roads, already primitive, turned to impassable mud, preventing the movement of grain from regions with slight surpluses to those with total crop failure. Local lords hoarded what little food they had, and the complex feudal obligations that were supposed to provide a safety net completely unraveled. People did not starve because there was no food anywhere. They starved because the system to move that food had utterly failed. The result was mass death, cannibalism, and a complete erosion of the social order, all stemming from a rupture in the most basic infrastructure of distribution. These historical breakdowns force us to look at our own world with new eyes. How many of our cities are just 3 missed shipments away from empty supermarket shelves? The stability we take for granted is a delicate dance, entirely dependent on the uninterrupted flow of goods along global highways and shipping lanes. A single pandemic, a volcanic eruption, or a conflict in a strategic waterway could, in theory, recreate the conditions of the Great Famine on a global scale. The hidden infrastructure of supply is the true foundation of power, and its failure is a silent alarm that echoes through the centuries. A single, dominant culture can be an empire's greatest strength until it becomes its fatal blind spot. The 23rd hidden force is cultural assimilation resistance, the explosive backlash that occurs when a ruling power tries to crush local identities and impose a single, uniform way of life. This is not about the natural blending of cultures, but the forceful erasure of one by another and the inevitable, ferocious pushback it provokes. consider the Saxon revolts against Charlemagne, the very emperor who forged a vast European empire. His conquest of Saxony was not just a military campaign, it was a cultural crusade. He demanded that the pagan Saxons convert to Christianity, destroying their sacred groves and imposing his faith by the sword. The Saxons, led by figures like Widukind, did not submit peacefully. They rose up again and again in desperate, bloody revolts that dragged on for decades. Charlemagne's response was famously brutal, including the mass execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day. But this violence only deepened the resentment, proving that faith forced at the point of a sword is a faith built on a powder keg. The immense resources Charlemagne had to pour into pacifying Saxony weakened his broader empire, showing how forced assimilation can bleed a state dry from within. The same pattern shattered the Avar Cognate in Eastern Europe. The Avars were a powerful steppe confederation that had terrorized Europe for centuries, extracting tribute from surrounding peoples. Their power, however, was built on the suppression and exploitation of a diverse mix of subject tribes, including Slavs and others. The Avars remained a distinct, dominant elite, never integrating these groups into their cultural or political structure. They were rulers, not leaders. When the Frankish armies under Charlemagne finally smashed the Avar ring fortress, the suppressed population saw their chance. They did not rally to defend their Avar overlords, they rose up against them. The Cognate, brittle from its own exclusionary policies, collapsed from the inside out, torn apart by the very people it had subjugated for generations. This force reveals a profound truth about imperial endurance. Control is not just about armies and taxes, it is about legitimacy in the eyes of the diverse peoples who live under your rule. An empire that dismisses local traditions, languages, and beliefs as inferior is not demonstrating strength. It is broadcasting its own insecurity and sowing the seeds of its own destruction. The resentment simmers for years, waiting only for a moment of imperial weakness to erupt into open rebellion. How many modern nations, with their mosaic of ethnicities and traditions, are silently grappling with this same ancient tension between unity and diversity? The most stable empire is not a monolith but a tapestry, and when you try to iron it flat, you risk tearing the entire fabric apart. Command of the sea is the ultimate strategic advantage until it is lost. The 24th hidden force is naval power loss. The moment an empire's watery highways are suddenly closed or controlled by a rival. For a maritime power, the sea is not a barrier, it is the very source of its wealth and security. When that control slips away, the empire is not just defeated, it is suffocated. The Venetian Republic learned this through a long, painful decline. For centuries, the Lion of St. Mark ruled the Mediterranean, its galleys carrying the riches of the East to its magnificent lagoon. But as the Ottoman Empire grew in strength, it began to challenge Venetian naval supremacy. The loss of key islands like Cyprus and Crete, followed by the slow, grinding erosion of its control over sea lanes, was a death by 1,000 cuts. Venetian merchants could no longer guarantee safe passage, and the wealth that built the city of canals gradually dried up. Venice did not fall in a single battle. It was slowly starved of the maritime commerce that was its lifeblood, shrinking from a global power into a beautiful, isolated relic. This demonstrates that naval power is not merely about winning wars, it is about securing the economic arteries that keep an empire alive. A single naval engagement, however, can deliver a shock that changes the world. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was the greatest sea battle of its age, a colossal clash between the Holy League, led by Spain and Venice, and the Ottoman Empire. The Christian victory was celebrated across Europe, a triumphant moment that seemed to halt Ottoman expansion. Yet, in a profound historical lesson, this tactical win failed to produce a lasting strategic advantage. The Ottomans, with their immense resources and shipbuilding capacity, rebuilt their fleet within a year. Lepanto did not break their naval power, but it did reveal its limits. The battle marked the beginning of a slow shift in the Mediterranean balance of power, proving that even a glorious victory at sea is meaningless if it does not translate into permanent control over the trade and territories that matter. The decline of the Hanseatic League offers a different perspective on the same force. This powerful confederation of merchant guilds and towns dominated trade in the Baltic and North Seas, a naval and commercial empire without a single crowned head. Its strength was its network of ports and its fleet of merchant vessels, the cog ships that were the container ships of the medieval world. But as powerful centralized states like England and the Netherlands rose, they began to build their own powerful navies to protect their own commercial interests. The Hanseatic League, a decentralized network, could not compete with the focused naval might of these emerging nation-states. Its influence waned, its trade privileges were revoked, and its once vital sea routes were taken over by others. The League did not lose a great naval battle, it was simply rendered irrelevant, demonstrating that even a commercial giant cannot survive if it loses command of the waters that carry its goods. This hidden force asks a critical question of any nation whose prosperity is tied to the ocean. How do you maintain a fleet, secure your shipping lanes, and innovate in naval technology without being bankrupted by the endless expense? The sea is a ruthless master, and its favor can be withdrawn as quickly as the tide. And just as control of the sea depends on controlling the ships that sail it, the final, and perhaps most potent hidden force, is about controlling the one thing that flows faster than any current, information itself. Knowledge is the ultimate currency of power, and its mismanagement can prove more fatal than any battlefield defeat. The 25th hidden force is information control failures, the critical breakdown in how empires gather, verify, and communicate intelligence. When a state loses its grip on the flow of information, it becomes blind, deaf, and utterly vulnerable to threats it can no longer see coming. The Mongol Empire, at its zenith, understood this principle perfectly. It operated the Yam, a sophisticated postal relay system that spanned its entire continent-spanning domain. Fresh horses and riders were stationed at outposts a day's ride apart, allowing messages and intelligence to travel from one end of the empire to the other with astonishing speed. This network was the nervous system of Mongol rule, enabling the Great Khan to receive reports from distant governors, dispatch orders to his generals, and respond to crises with a coordination that his fragmented enemies could never match. But when the empire began to fracture after Kublai Khan's death, this very system broke down. The relay stations fell into disrepair, messages were delayed or intercepted, and the different khanates lost their shared operational awareness. They could no longer act as a single, cohesive unit. The disruption of the Yam did not just slow down mail, it severed the vital connections that held the empire together, accelerating its political fragmentation into separate and often rival states. This vulnerability extends beyond mere delays to the poison of misinformation. In the heat of battle, a single piece of false intelligence or a tragically delayed order can rewrite history. Consider the Battle of Crecy during the 100 Years' War. The French army, vastly outnumbering the English, was confident of victory. However, their command and control was a shambles. Orders were slow to reach the front lines, and different divisions of the French army attacked in uncoordinated waves, some commanders unaware of the disasters unfolding ahead of them. This fatal lack of real-time communication and clear intelligence led to the French knights charging blindly into a storm of English longbow arrows, resulting in a catastrophic defeat. They were not outfought in terms of bravery, they were outmanaged in terms of information. The French command structure failed to control the narrative of the battle as it happened, and that failure cost them the field. This force highlights a terrifying truth for any complex society. An empire can have the strongest army and the fullest treasury, but if its leaders are operating on bad information, or if their commands cannot reach their executors in time, every decision becomes a gamble. Censorship that blocks out dissenting voices creates an echo chamber where rulers hear only what they want to hear. Espionage that goes undetected allows an enemy to know your plans better than you do. The resilience of an empire, therefore, is not just measured in its walls and weapons, but in the speed, accuracy, and security of its communications. In our own age of instant digital information and pervasive disinformation campaigns, this ancient challenge has only grown more acute. How do we know what is true, and how quickly can we act on that knowledge before the opportunity or the threat has already passed? The final hidden force is the most difficult to measure, yet perhaps the most decisive of all. Spiritual and moral decay acts as a slow poison in the veins of a civilization, eroding the invisible bonds of trust and shared purpose that hold an empire together. Ancient Roman historians like Livy did not merely record military defeats or economic crises. They lamented a perceived loss of virtue, a collective turning away from the pious, disciplined values that had built the Republic. They wrote of luxury making men soft, of politicians pursuing personal glory over the public good, and of the gods withdrawing their favor from a people who had forgotten their sacred duties. This was not just philosophical hand-wringing, it was a diagnosis of a fatal illness in the empire's soul. When the ruling class is widely seen as corrupt, self-serving, and impious, the populace begins to withdraw its consent, not through open revolt, but through a quiet, corrosive cynicism. Why should a citizen pay taxes or fight for a state that no longer embodies the virtues it claims to champion? This crisis of legitimacy makes every other problem worse, transforming challenges into catastrophes. The dramatic fall of the Knights Templar perfectly illustrates this principle in action. For 2 centuries, they were the most powerful military order in Christendom, revered as pious, disciplined warrior monks who protected pilgrims and amassed vast wealth. But their very power made them enemies, including the King of France, Philip IV, who was deeply in debt to them. He could not defeat them on the battlefield, so he attacked their reputation, launching a campaign of propaganda and torture fueled by accusations of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rituals. The specific charges were almost certainly false, but the perception of moral corruption stuck. The Templars' aura of invincibility and divine favor evaporated overnight. Without that moral authority, they had no defense against the king's political and legal assault. Their Grand Master was burned at the stake, and their order was dissolved. They were not defeated by a superior army, but by a successfully manufactured narrative of spiritual decay. This force reminds us that an empire is not just an economic and military machine. It is a story that people tell themselves about who they are and what they stand for. When that story becomes one of greed, hypocrisy, and impiety, the will to sustain the empire simply vanishes. Prophecies of doom become self-fulfilling, not because they are magically true, but because they capture a widespread loss of faith. The people, seeing no virtue left to defend, may simply stand aside as the walls are breached, wondering if the empire they once knew had already fallen long before the final collapse. These 26 hidden forces rarely act alone. They weave together into a perfect storm where economic shockwaves amplify political fragmentation, and environmental catastrophe ignites the social unrest that shatters a civilization from within. The fall of an empire is not a single event, but a cascade of failures, each one making the next inevitable. The resilience of any society, ancient or modern, hinges not on its apparent strength, but on its deep-seated capacity for adaptability. It must be able to foresee coming shifts, to bend without breaking, and to govern with a balance that earns the enduring trust of its people. So as you look at the world around you, consider these ancient patterns. Which of our own systems feel unshakable, and which might be masking a critical vulnerability? Is it our complex global supply chains, our digital financial networks, or the stability of our climate? The past offers us a powerful lens, not to predict a doomed future, but to recognize the early warnings of decline. We have the unique opportunity to learn from history's greatest collapses and consciously build a more resilient world. I would love to hear your perspective. In the comments, tell me which of these 26 hidden forces you believe is the most pressing for our time, and why. If these deep dives into history's mysteries resonate with you, subscribe to continue unlocking the past's most vital lessons. Remember, the stories of fallen empires are not just tales of dust and ruins, they are guidebooks for our own journey forward. Let us learn from them together.